I think the next book I'm going to read is from C.L.R. James. I think that I want to see what the thing is. African Critical Theory. Cabral's critical theory of national history, national culture, and national liberation. In order for us to really and truly grasp and grapple with Amilcar Cabral's conception of and articulation of critical theory, as well as his innovative contributions to the Africana tradition of critical theory, we must carefully consider 1. Cabral's critical theory of national history, 2. Cabral's critical theory of national culture, and finally, Cabral's critical theory on national liberation. That being understood, we should begin our discussion by openly acknowledging and emphasizing that Cabral's concept of culture was inextricably from his understanding of history. History for Cabral is the narrative of the imbalances and conflicts, economic, political, and social, that historically and contemporarily shape and characterize the development of a society. And culture is a series of, quote, dynamic syntheses which have been developed and established, end quote. To solve and resolve social and political conflicts at each stage is an evolution of society. Cabral, 1979, emphasized the elasticity and durability of culture, even in the face of colonialism. One of the most serious mistakes if not the most serious mistake made by the colonial powers in Africa, may have been to ignore or underestimate the cultural strength of African peoples. This attitude is particularly clear in the case of Portuguese colonial domination. In Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, which he underscored, quote, was not content with denying absolutely the existence of cultural values of African and his conditions as a social being, but has persisted in forbidding him any kind of political activity. The colonizer confused repression with destruction. To impress the colonized peoples, culture is not to destroy their culture. It is quite simply, among other things, an attempt to denounce, denude, and degrade the culture of the colonized. But denying something, or even more, distorting something, does not destroy it. It merely means that one has chosen, perhaps, to ignore or negatively characterize an actually existing concrete fact, or force. However, in response to this conundrum, Cabral contended that the capacity for, quote, cultural resistance by African and other racially colonized people was not destroyed. On the contrary, quote, African culture, though repressed, persecuted, and betrayed by some social categories or social classes who compromised with colonialism, served all the storms by taking refuge in the villages, in the forest, and in the spirit of generations of victims of colonialism. It was Cabral's impassioned belief that the real potential for anti-colonial revolution, which is to say, quote, national liberation, rested on the ironic fact that the great majority of the racially colonized people, the wretched of the earth, had only marginally been affected, if at all, by colonial culture. Deep in the forests, in most rural and remote parts of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, the semi-colonized retained and often recreated their cultures and reinvented ethnic identities. Cabral asserted that it was these untapped aspects of pre-colonial and traditional culture that should be built on in the interest of developing anti-colonial culture and a new binational transcendent consciousness. The development of consciousness in Cabral's conceptual universe is inextricably from ideological development and critical conceptual generations. Cabral, in some senses, similar to Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was a Marxist. They were part of the left, I think the left Italian Communist Party. And they wrote a lot of things in prison because they imprisoned him. Because I think Mussolini, I think it was during Mussolini times that they took over, and they imprisoned a lot of left Italian communists, Marxists. Antonio Gramsci was one. He read a lot of his works inside the prison. Antonio Gramsci, the Frankfurt School, and other European and European American critical theorists apprehended that just as the ruling race, gender, and or class produces ideas and theories which support their oppressing, exploiting, and alienating established disorder, racially colonized and dominated groups can and often do, as Patricia Hill Collins, 1997, relates, produce alternatives and oppositional knowledges and ideologies. For Cabral, as Carlos Lopes has pointed out, ideology was above all knowing what one wanted in one's own particular circumstances. Ideological strength is built by knowing what must be done in each specific situation. This does not prevent, but rather requires a drawing on the scientific law of historical evolution of society. But one must always be alert to the concrete reality of the moment. Let me get my water real quick. Goal, or whatever. This is a point that has direct relevance for the discussion at hand concerning Cabral's contribution to the discursive development of African critical theory. First, one of the greatest challenges Cabral presents to Africa critical theory is that it constantly a self-reflective, concretized, historized, and politicized, as well as an attempt to grasp and grapple with the world as it actually exists. That is to say, quote, always be alert to the concrete reality of the movement and the moment, which is to say, quote, always be, oh wait, I already said that, sorry. Wait, no I didn't, which is to say to follow the best that W.E.B. Du Bois, Leon Gontran, Damas, Angela Davis, Walter Rodney, and Bell Hooks, among others, offer a radical politics and critical social theory. Contemporary Africana critical theory must be willing and able to decidedly break with abstract academic disciplinaries, decadent, epistemological, insular, and often almost exclusively European and European American derived discourse. If and I humbly pray when this is done, it is hoped that workers of Africana critical race theory will produce critical thought and text that will prompt and promote critical consciousness, raising the radical political activity that ultimately leads to revolutionary practice that will enable us not to simply describe and interpret the world, but in the spirit of Amilcar Cabral, to positively and progressively engage and alter in it in the best interest of the continental and diasporan Africans and the wider world of the wretched of the earth. Secondly, Cabral's concept of ideology was concrete and situation specific, which is, of course, why he remarks and reminds us Marx was not a member of a tribal, read traditional African or radicalized colonized Africa. Okay, I'm going to read it again. Remind us, Marx was not a member of the tribal society, and that in point of fact, Marxism is not a religion, and Marx did not write about Africa. He did in his, I'm gonna reflames it. He did in his later years when he was about to unalive. He did go to, I think, to Algeria, to finish his magnum opus, which was capital. But he did observe the colonial situation and stuff. He just hadn't had time to write it all out and put his his thoughts to pen and paper of like what he was observing. So there is that fact that he did go to an African nation and did observe it, but it was during his last years. So I don't know if anything got published really. So that being said, Cabral, to a certain extent, acknowledged that he took Fanon's challenge in Wretched of the Earth, 1968, very seriously when he asserted Marxist analysis should always be slightly stretched. Every time we have to do with the colonial problem, everything up to and including the very nature of pre-capitalist societies, so well explained by Marx, but must here be thought out again. So there's the distinction right there. I think Walter Rodney talks about that Marx needs to be stretched. And I think he says Fanon says the same thing. So yeah, Cabral comprehended that Douglas Kellner claims the Frankfurt School and other European and European American critical theorists understand that first and foremost, quote, there has never been a unitary Marxian theory that has been the basis of for socialists or any other reportedly democratic or egalitarian type of development. I don't know about that. Also, Marx or any other so-called radical theory must of necessity be open to revision and reconstruction as new historical, cultural, social, and political situation and circumstances present themselves to local and global, national and international societies in civilization. And finally, Cabral considering the deficiency in of Marxist theory. I disagree with this, honestly, that it may very well be that our, quote, new times, to borrow from Stuart Hall, requires more merely revision and reconstruction of modern and or postmodern theory, but an altogether new critical theory to speak to the special needs of contemporary society and the world of the 21st century. In advocating a new critical theory I essentially have in mind a contemporary descriptive and proscriptive dialectical and discerning praxis prompting social political theory that does not simply chronicle. Is that right? Chronicle? I think I got it right. And critique current crises, situations, and circumstances, but acknowledge the necessity of its own internal discursive development, self-critique, and self-correction in light of this novel crises, situation, and circumstances. It is an epistemically and existentially open-ended theory of contemporary societies which sidesteps the intellectual insularity. Is that right? Insularity? Okay.
Can't read along because the writing's so small on my phone and I've got a headache that night.
It's okay. Too much of European and European American critical theory, what Wood calls white Emercall critical theory, and in the ensuing essay, and attempts to engage and eradicate our current social ills, say, for instance, racism, sexism, capitalism, colonialism, homophobia, heterosexism, and religious intolerance, among other elements of contemporary imperialism. This, quote, new critical theory should build on and go beyond not solely European and European American critical theory, but must also, out of the exigency, be willing and able to engage the critical theory produced by and on the behalf of the non-European, non-white world, its organic intellectuals, radical. Now, there's some Marxist thought that believe in organic intellectuals. There's some white Marxists that believe in the organic intellectualism. So, radical political activists, critical social theorists, and most importantly, its working class and masses. In somewhat plainer English, the new critical theory, which our new times demands, should base its description, prescription, and proscription and all available radical and revolutionary sources. And if truth be told, both European and non-European traditions of critical theory have much to offer. It does to reiterate the non-white working classes and masses traditions of critical theory, especially as expressed in popular music and popular culture, key aspects of which I have humbly chronicled and critically engaged in hip-hop's inheritance, hip-hop's amnesia, and hip-hop movement. As Stuart Hall has correctly observed, our new times make it mandatory that contemporary critical theorists be cautious of changes out there and in there. Out there meaning, perhaps, out there in the jungles, or of post everything, or out there in the world of white hegemony and subtle white supremacy, ethnic absolutism and cultural racism, or out there where cultural bureaucracies attempt to administer all aspects of public and private life, as well as human thought and behavior. And by in there, we are wont to take Hall to mean in here, where political boundaries are often blurred, and some critical theorists remain undaunted and bold enough to contest and combat cultural racism, cultural hegemony, and cultural bureaucracy. In here, where there exists those who critical theories represent a very real ethnicization and feminization and sexualization of radical theory and politics, and perhaps in here where it is understood that there can be no simple return or recovery of the ancestral past, which is not re-experienced through categories of the present, no base for creative enunciation, and in a simple reproduction of traditional forms, which are not transformed by the technologies and identities of the present. Contemporary critical theory should, among other things, get involved in the debates about how society is changing and offer new descriptions of analysis of social conditions it seeks to transcend and transform. Also, critical theory of contemporary societies should, on one hand, hear a solemnly heed Cabral's 1979 especially, when he asserted, quote, "Experience of the struggle shows how utopian and absurd it is to seek to apply schemas developed by other people in the course of their liberation struggles, and solutions which they found to the question and problems with which they were or are confronted, without considering local reality, and especially cultural reality. We must also be cognizant of Cabral's contention that anything that is want to be labeled critical and theory needs to be an ongoing synthesis drawn from and hopefully contributing to the best of the contemporary radical politics and radical economics, heterodox economics, as well as critical social theory, which critical social practice. And on the other hand, the new critical theory should to a certain extent acknowledge and advocate with Max Hochheim and Douglas Killiner that first, critical theory must, quote, never aim simply at an increase of knowledge. As such, its goal is man's emancipation from slavery. And second, that with that understood, contemporary critical theory must come to accept that classical and orthodox Marxism exaggerated the primacy of class. I don't agree with that either. And in almost every instance, it downplays the salience of race, gender, sexuality, and other cultures and identities, issued areas and or arenas in Killiner's candid words. See, we still believe that, like, out of capitalist relations rise these social relations and these mechanisms to keep people subjugated and oppressed and not emancipated. So they utilize like the racial hierarchy structure in order to engage with exploitation of people and stuff like that. So I don't agree completely, because Marx does talk about these things in a Marxist stance, because we understand that the economic base of capitalism arises these social relations and these institutions that impact back onto we call it the material base, which is the economic base. So They both are impacting each other, and that is taught in Marxist theory too. So I don't know. It's just what I've read so far about Marxism and stuff so far. So I don't know if I completely agree with that part, but to each their own. We're going to take what we like out of this and keep it. You know what I mean? There's some good things out of this, but there's also like, Clearly, oppression takes place in many more spheres than just the economic, which I agree, and the workplace. But the workplace, in our case, in the United States, has those racial disparities with inside the workplace, because we can see it through Black people being hired and fired first, or not being able to achieve going up the ladder, or being hired for dangerous jobs, and you know what I mean, those things like that, and racism with inside those relations, you know what I mean. So we could see that. I at least I see that part. So radical politics and the future should take account of gender and race as well as class. Nonetheless, it should be wrong to ignore the centrality of class and the importance of class politics. But the radical politics today should be more multicultural, race and gender focused and broad-based than the original Marxian and Western European critical theory. Cabral contributes to Africana and European critical theory in light of the fact that his thoughts accent and emphasize the ways in which national liberation, that Horkheimer above phrased man's emancipation from slavery, is predicated on the struggling people's understanding that both of colonialism and neocolonialism, the essential characteristics of imperialist domination, remain the same: denial of historical process of the dominated people by means of violent usurpation of the freedom of process of development of national productive forces. It is the denial of the historical process of the dominated people in economic, culture, social, political, and other areas that validates and legitimates the national liberation struggle. This is because national liberation struggles is nothing other than a phenomenon and process through which a social, political, economic, and cultural group or nation class rejects the denial of deretrogression of its history and heritage. Recalls it was Cabral who audaciously asserted, quote, self-determination for all peoples. Each people must choose their destiny and take it into their own hands. In other words, the national liberation of people is the regaining the historical personality of that people. It is their return to history through the destruction of imperialist domination to which they are subjected. Deconstruction and reconstruction, as I noted in African critical theory, and the negritude movement, that's black and white, and the Litmofets in Africana philosophical and critical theoretical discourse, and as the famed African American philosopher Lucius Outlaw observed, considering the European incursion into Africa and the subsequent enslavement of colonization of African people and the domination of Europeans of African lands and resources, efforts to fashion an African, and I would add Africana, they use the A at the end, philosophy poses both destructive and reconstructive challenges. In my view, Cabral's critical theory of national liberation puts forward such challenges because it is simultaneously an act of history and an act of culture. With regards to national liberation as pivotal historical movements, Cabral stated that the basis for national liberation, wherever the formula is adopted in international law, it is an inalienable right of every people to have their own history. And the aim of the national liberation is to regain this rights usurped by imperialism. That is to free the process of development of the national productive forces. Concerning national liberation as an act of culture, Cabral understood that imperialist domination by, quote, denying the dominant people their own historical process, dominated people, necessarily denies their cultural process. This is so because every moment of the life of a society, open or closed culture, is the result, with more or less awakening consciousness of economic and political activities, and more or less dynamic expressions of the type of relations prevailing within that society, on the one hand, and on the other hand, among individual groups of individuals, social stratas, or classes. In light of the above, it is important here to critically engage Cabral's extremely elastic concept of culture. Because culture is moving, it moves and it progresses. It doesn't stay stagnant. Culture, if it's unfettered and not like subdued or subjugated, it moves. Culture like advances and moves and develops differently all the time. It never stays stagnant. I said that again. Culture, according to Cabral, is simultaneously the fruit of a people's history and a determinant of history, by positive and negative influences exerts on the evolution of relations between man and his environment, and among men or human groups within a society, as well as different societies. Imperialism in the form of radical colonialism, racial colonialism represents, to employ terms used by Cabral to describe this phenomenon, the paralyzes stagnation, regression, deviation, and halting of the dominant people's human agency. In other words, it intentionally blocks their capacity, ontologically speaking, to become and make themselves known to each other and to other human groups in their own terms and in their own culturally distinct way. Tanzania, I can't say this word, Sarah Quenberhan, has argued that colonialism petrifies and subjugates culture. At the same time, may be said of its effects on the dominated groups. History, if therefore history and culture are understood as Sarah Quenberhan, closely following Cabral's lead, comprehending them, then history and culture can be comprehended as, quote, the actuality of engagements, intellectuals, artistic, spiritual, and material in which a people unveil its existence. History and culture then are always the unconditionally to be understood in a plural as the various modes of being and doing of human existence, emphasized or in original. Cabral consistently emphasized the need to not only acknowledge but also to challenge one-dimensional and racial essentialist interpretations of Africa's history, cultures, and struggles. A profound analysis of cultural reality removes the supposition that there can be continental or racial cultures. It is because, as with history, culture develops in an uneven process at the level of a continent, a race, or even a society. The coordinates of culture, like those of any developing phenomenon, vary in space and time. See, it's not stagnant, it's not, rather they be material, physical, or human, biological, and social. The fact of recognizing the existence of common and special traits in the cultures of African peoples, independently of the color of their skin, does not necessarily amply apply that. Oh wait, that's not apply. Yeah, it was amply not apply. It's amply that one and only one culture exists on the continent. In the same way that, from the economic and political point of view, one can note the existence of various Africas. So there are also various African cultures. See, he even says that like culture is not stagnation; it develops and everything. So yeah, when and where history and culture are comprehended in this way, in the plural, and as Sarah Quenberhan said, as the various modes of being and doing of human existence, then, and perhaps only then, is Cabral's call for a, quote, return to the source most comprehensible. For Cabral, Africa, which is to say Africa's histories, cultures, and peoples, is much more complex, a culture more wide-ranging and diverse than previously noted by colonial anthropologists, ethnologists, and missionaries, and others, including European education, or rather, European miseducated Africans and their all-encompassing theories of Africans' ancient and glorious past. This, of course, is not in any way to amply that Africa did not have an ancient and glorious past, but not only to emphasize that not everything in Africa's past was paradisically. Ooh, we're gonna look at that word. I tried. Who's this? Don't know who Desert Cowboy is. Don't know who you are. All right, Paradisiacal.
Paradisiacal.
Paradisiacal. Relating to, resembling, or befitting paradise.
Paradisiacal.
Was paradisiacal in that contemporary Africana critical theory should employ Cabral's distinct dialectical and historical materialism when approaching Africa's histories and cultures and struggle. Additionally, Cabral argued in some senses, very similar to Fanon, that it must always be born in the mind that the national liberation struggle, or any struggle against imperialism, raises consciousness, transforms, and brings into being new traditions, and introduces new cultural elements, if not completely new, African culture and values. One of the new traditions, i.e. new conceptually speaking, that Cabral's radical politics and revolutionary practice historically and currently contributes to is what I have come to call the Africana tradition of critical theory, or more simply, African critical theory. But what does Cabral call it? I'm just kidding. Next, any questions before I move on to the next point? Okay. All right. Cabral's contribution to African critical theory, radical politics, and critical social theory, and the anti-imperialist interests of the wretched of the earth of the 21st century. Next topic. As observed above, Amilcar Cabral presents African critical theory with several significant challenges, and throughout the course of this introduction, it has been important to accent and amplify the ways in which his life work necessitates a fundamental rethinking of critical theory in general, and more specifically, a discourse of development of African culture theory. Cabral's thought serves as a cue and calls for a concrete philosophy and Africana philosophy of praxis, a historically nuanced, culturally grounded, and politically charged form of critical social theory that speaks to a special needs of continental and diasporan Africans, eschewing the scholasticism and abstract system building of the bulk of European and European American trained philosophers of African descent. Cabral constantly developed accessible critical theories of the changing conditions of contemporary society, the prospect of Pan-African democratic socialist revolution, revolutionary decolonization, revolutionary re-Africanization, revolutionary nationalism, revolutionary humanism. He has ever, and that's something, there's a debate on Marxist debate. There's some Marxist humanists and anti-humanist debate, which we'll go over that soon, and I'll be able to talk more about that later when we get past that one chapter. Gonzo. Humanism. Go ahead.
Oh no, I was asking what happened.
No. There's going to be somewhere in the book that we're studying. It's going to be the debate on humanism and anti-humanism. It'll give us more indication of what those two terms mean. You know what I mean? In a Marxist perspective. That's all.
Awesome. Alrighty.
He was very concerned to utilize theory as a weapon against imperialism and to unite it not only with the emancipatory aspiration, but also with the actual emancipatory efforts of the people of Cape Verde and Guinea-Bissau, as well as the other wretched of the earth struggling against imperialism around the globe. Cabral also always admonished intellectual activists to be critically cognizant of our particular circumstances and situations, but as revolutionary humanists to remain open to learning what we can from the lived experience of experiments, social, political, and cultural experiments of others, is his own weighted words. The experience of others is highly significant for someone undergoing any experiences. The reality of others is highly significant for one's reality. Many folk do not understand this and grasp their reality with the passion of passion that they are going to invent everything. Quote, I do not want to do the same as others have done, nothing that others have done. This is a sign of arrogance, ignorance. If you want to do something in reality, you must see who has really done the same, who has done something similar, and who has done something opposite, or that you can learn something from their experiences. It is not to copy completely, because every reality has its own questions and its own answers for these questions. There are many things which belong to many realities jointly. It is essentially that the experience of others benefits us. We must be able to derive from everyone's experience what we can adopt or to our conditions to avoid unnecessary efforts and sacrifices. This is very important. Cabral, 1979. Here, Cabral sets down several of core characteristics of Cabralism and what it essentially contributes to the Africana tradition of critical theory. In good dialectical fashion, Cabral suggests that we start with our own circumstances and situations, but maintain an epistemic and experiential openness, and be willing and able to appropriate and adapt the advance or breakthroughs of others as they pertain to our circumstances and situation. As this advances and breakthroughs could, in many stances, aid us in avoiding unnecessary efforts and sacrifices. He firmly warns us not to copy completely, because our lived reality, that is to say, our concrete conditions and unique historical happenings, are distinct from those of any people and any other age. We are to always remember that, quote, every reality has its own questions and its own answers for these questions. The above caveat should also be connected to Cabral's earlier discussions of the plurality of African histories, cultures, and struggles. Indeed, Cabral and his comrades provided solutions to many problems, crucial answers to several critical questions. But contemporary critical theorists must keep cognizant of the fact that Cabral and his comrades provided solutions to particular problems they were faced with in their specific historical moment, as they were confronting the conundrum of an extremely particular, if not peculiar, form of racial colonialism, Portuguese colonialism. And should be recalled that Cabral critically contended the people of Africa who are fighting against Portuguese colonialism have suffered under very special conditions, because for the past 40 years we have been under the domination of fascist regime. He importantly continued, Portugal is an economically backward country in which about 50% of the population is illiterate, a country which you will find at the bottom of all the statistical tables of Europe. Point blank, Portugal is a country in no position at all to dominate any other country. This means then that it is equally important for contemporary critical theorists, Africana or otherwise, to bear in mind that, however attractive Cabral's thought thought, no matter how fervently we believe it to speak to the special issues we are confronted with in the 21st century. His contributions to critical theory cannot provide us with the concrete and nuanced historical culture understanding necessary to develop revolutionary political praxis and revolutionary social movements, which is to say, national and international decolonization and liberation struggles aim at altering the novel social and political problems of the present. There simply is no substitution for contemporary critical theorists practicing conceptual generations and intellectual innovations. There is no problem-solving proxies for our earnest development and new praxis promoting theory geared towards not only gouging but actually changing contemporary societies, bringing into being a new humanity, new societies, and perhaps even a new world culture and civilization grounded in the growing out of various international traditions of revolutionary decolonization, revolutionary humanism, critical multiculturalism, democratic socialism, which I don't agree with democratic socialism, racial, I don't know if they're meaning socialism democratically, but yeah, I disagree with that part. Radical justice, gender justice, women's liberation, freedom of sexual orientation, and respect for diverse religious affiliations, among others. However, even in light of all the critical observations above, I continue to believe that Cabral's theoretic strategy framework, which is to say Cabralism, is extremely useful for those critical theorists concerned with not merely colonialism, neocolonialism, and post-colonialism, but also racism, critical race theory, revolutionary nationalism, revolutionary humanism, decolonization, re-Africanization, and the critique of capitalism, a class struggle, is contemporary society. Oh my gosh, I have to appeal. Cabralism indeed does offer critical concepts and innovating analytical categories. It does in fact provide a wide range of principles and prospects that make intelligible the and constantly changing character of contemporary colonialism, capitalism, and racism. Further, it seems to prophetically prefigure and point to new untapped types of revolutionary movement, and even goes too far to suggest several distinct directions for future radical politics, critical social theory, and revolutionary praxis. Cabral is distinctive in that it audaciously challenges contemporary theorists to actual ontological speaking by simultaneously critical and theorist, intellectual, and activist. It explicitly asks that critical theorists embrace the dialectical task of transforming themselves and their societies, which once again are situated in specific historical moments with concrete conditions and particular social and political problems, corroborating Cabral and, in a sense, updating his thesis that every reality has its own questions and its own answers for these questions. The Ghanaian philosopher Kwame Gaiki, 1995, has stated, philosophers belong to a given culture or era or tradition, select those concepts or cluster of concepts that for one reason or another matter most, and that therefore are brought to the fore in their analysis. These concepts and clusters of concepts are employed insofar as specific philosophers understand them to offer the most compelling and comprehensive means to alter contemporary societies and even more contemporary souls, following the fundamental thrust of Du Bois' contribution to critical theory. Gaiki commented further, if one were to examine the culture and historical settings of the intellectual focus, concern, and direction of the individual thinker, one would be convinced beyond doubt that philosophy is a conceptual response to the basic human problems that arise in any given society, in a given epoch. Such an examination will reveal that philosophers grapple at the conceptual level with problems and issues and their times, even though this does not mean that the relevance of their ideas, insights, arguments, and conclusions is to be tethered to those times. For more often than not, the relevance of their insights and arguments, or at least some of them, transcends the confines of their own times and cultures, and thus can be embraced by other cultures or societies or different generational epochs. In other words, the philosophical doctrine may be historic, that is, generated originally in response to some historical event or circumstances, without our having to look on it as historicistic, without our having to confine its significance simply to those times of history when it was actually produced. The fact that the philosophers who produced the ideas and arguments were given conceptual response and attention to the experiences of their times need to be stressed and constantly borne in mind. It was the problem of the time of constituted the point of departure and their reflective analysis. Cabral compels Africana critical theory to consider the concrete conditions of philosophical settings, reminding us that it may be extremely useful to acknowledge and engage the fact that the manner in which philosophy is inextricably from notion of, most especially traditions, but also history and heritage as well. Other Guianan philosophers, Kawasa Wayarda, has asserted that the philosophy of a people is always a tradition, and that a tradition presupposes a certain minimum of organic relationships among, or at least some of its elements. He goes on to observe, if a tradition of modern philosophy is to develop and flourish in Africa, there will have to be philosophical interactions and cross-fertilization among contemporary African workers in philosophy, insomuch as it is reputedly a return to history and culture of African peoples. Cabral critically returns to the sources, suggests in no uncertain terms that Africana critical theory of contemporary societies concern itself with the deconstruction of European derived continental and diasporan African philosophical discourse, and the reconstruction of a radically decolonized and re-Africanized critical theory and revolutionary praxis tradition. That is to say, that I have been referring to as the Africana tradition of critical theory and revolutionary praxis. The deconstruction of European-based continental and diasporan African philosophy presupposes that modern workers in Africa, philosophy and Africana studies in general, have an analytical skill and intellectual tool, not to mention the intellectual audacity to undertake such an endeavor. Furthermore, this endeavor being none the less than what has been identified and articulated in all of my work is Africana critical theory, must always and at its core, as a critical self-consciousness and critical self-reflective effort, be willing to and able to critique and correct its own subjective settings, concrete conditions, and insidiously inherited Eurocentric philosophical influence, as well as other imperialist intellectual influences, which in many, if not in most, instances keep it from doing what Gaiki, among others, understand the fundamental task of philosophy to be: 1. Provide people with a fundamental system of beliefs to live by. 2. Determine, quote, the nature of human values and how these values can be realized concretely in human societies. 3. Speculate about the whole range of human experiences by providing conceptual interpretations and analysis of that experience, necessarily doing so not only by responding to the basic issues and problems generated by that experience, but also by suggesting new or alternative ways of thought and action. And finally, 4, offering conceptual responses to problems posed in any given epoch or for a given society or culture. To speak of an Africana critical theory and contemporary movement means nothing less than speaking of and actively engaging in the critique, appreciation, appropriation, and disruption, if need be, of hitherto traditionals, or even more abstract academics and Eurocentric, European-influenced forms of continental diasporan African philosophy and intellectualism. As Cabral's critical theory suggests, the engagement of any form of field of knowledge should always and ever not for scholasticism, abstract system building, or simply nostalgia's sake, but in the interest of real living, suffering, and struggling women, men, and children. In other words, not knowledge for knowledge's sake, but knowledge for life and liberation sake. Again, Gaeki offers Africana philosophers advice. Philosophical knowledge and insight should benefit the society as a whole, not merely the philosophers personally. As philosophers of African descent continue to rescue and rediscover, as well as critically engage and reinterpret various philosophical systems and traditions, we must be vigilant, remaining constantly cautious of the fact that no matter which form of field of philosophy we feel compelled to engage, it is our solemn duty as philosophers, even more as critical theorists of contemporary societies, to do so in the spirit of Amilcar Cabral, seeking solutions to enigmatic issues of our epoch, always and ever willing and able to criticize and offer alternatives and correctives to contemporary crises and conundrums. Any questions? Doesn't look like it. We're going to a conclusion of this chapter, I think. Conclusion. Oh my gosh. It's all in different languages. I cannot do it. Amilcar Cabral did not initiate the Africana tradition of critical theory, but as foregoing demonstrated, he was certainly influenced by it and significantly contributed to it. In summary, then it must be openly admitted that the theoretical tensions noted in the previous sections point to and produce an extremely uneasy combination of criticisms and interpretations that deify simple synopsis or conventional conceptual rules. Consequently, most of Cabral's critics have theretofore downplayed and diminished the real brilliance and brawn of his work by failing to grasp his antinomies, and they have therefore put forward a divided and distorted Cabral, who is either, for example, a Pan-Africanist or Marxist, an African nationalist, or a revolutionary humanist, and on ad infinitum. As a matter of fact, even if readers only compare and contrast Wood and the present author's conception and articulation of Cabralism in the volume that at hand, each of the aforementioned superficial ascriptions are revealed to fall short, shamefully short of capturing the complex and chimonolic. I'm going to look at this word. It's a new word, everybody. Yay for words. CHAMELEONIC. Something or someone or something that frequently changes its appearance, behavior, opinions to adapt to different situations. Pronunciation. Oh God, everybody, here comes a commercial. chameleonic, that's weird, chameleonic character of Cabral's critical theory and the difficulties involved in interpreting it while employing the one-sided single subject theoretical and monodisciplinary discursive devices that his research writing in radicalism consistently transcended and traversed. Many dismiss Cabral and charge his work with being overly simplistic because it typically employs straightforward language, easily understood by the masses. Others, such as Wood and I, are attracted to his work because it is theoretically thick, rich in both radicality, and originality, and boldly crosses so many academic, theoretical, and political boundaries. No matter what one's ultimate attitude towards Cabral, I honestly believe that the fact that his thought and text continue to cause contemporary controversies, and that his ideas have been discussed and debated across the disciplines for more than 5 decades in some degree, point to the multidimensionality and transdisciplinarity of Cabralism, which offers enigmatic insights for everyone, either to embrace enthusiastically or demur definitely. Hence, the dialectic of attraction and compulsion in Cabral's study, of Cabral's study can partly be attributed to the ambiguities inherited in his adamantly sprawling thought and the monodisciplinary anxieties of many of the interpreters and misinterpreters of his work. If indeed this is the case, then several previous studies in his thought are seriously flawed because they have sought to grasp and grapple with Cabral's oeuvre using monodisciplinary instead of multidisciplinary methods and models. However, the deficiency of his thought and the problems with his approaches to critical issues confronting Africa and other oppressed peoples has any serious reader of resistance and decolonization will discover. Cabral forces his readers to think deeply, to criticize thoroughly, and to move beyond the imperialist impulses of the established order. Many critics have made solid criticisms of various aspects of Cabral's thought, but when analyzed objectively, his life work and insurgent intellectual legacy are impressive and awe-inspiring, as is his loyalty to the most radical politics and revolutionary praxis in Africana and world history. His impact and influence have been widespread, not only cutting across academic disciplines, but setting aglow several radical political programs and revolutionary social movements. Where some theorists dogmatically hold views simply because they are fashionable or politically popular, Cabral's work draws from a diverse array of often eclectic and enigmatic sources, and therefore offers no closed systems for absolute truth. Throughout this introduction, I have desperately attempted to demonstrate that his thought was constantly epistematically open and routinely responsive to changing historical and cultural conditions, especially in Africa, in its diaspora. There are several, sometimes stunning, transformations in his critical theory that are, in most instances, attempts to answer conundrums created by changing social, political, historical, and cultural conditions. In conclusion, then I would like to suggest that it is a epistemic openness and consistently non-dogmatic radicalism and revolutionary practice of Cabral's project, the richness and wide range and reach of his ideas, and the absence of any finished system or closed body of clearly defined truths that can be accepted or rejected at ease, which constitutes both the contemporary philosophical fascinations with the continual relevance of Amilcar Cabral, radical politics, critical social theory, and revolutionary practice. Cabral lives and will never die. Cabralism continues. Acknowledgement. Oh, wait. Unity, struggle, progress. This is our beloved homeland. Cabral via. I can't say those words because they're all in different language. We're not going to read that part. So that was the introduction. That was the introduction. We're on chapter 2. Imbrications of coloniality. I can't say it. Ugh. An introduction to Cabralist critical theory in relations to contemporary struggles. Dan Wood. Oh, any questions before we move on?
No.
Okay. Those who view this as being theoretical, we would recall that every practice gives birth to a theory. If it is true that a revolution can fail, even though it is nurtured and perfectly conceived theory, nobody has yet successfully practiced revolution without a revolutionary theory. Cabral, Havana, 1966. The translated speech of Amilcar Cabral in the present volume proved fascinating, important, and timely for a variety of reasons. First, they provide insights not only into the thought of one of Africa's most profound revolutionaries, but they also offer a unique foray into African anti-colonial politics more generally. The speeches are significant for any study of the histories of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde, a concrete critical analysis of Africa anti-imperialism. Oh my gosh, it's the second one. The African anti-imperialists, and for the study of political and social revolutions in the 20th century. Secondly, Cabral offers a wealth of resources, critical, theoretical thinking and praxis. This is not only because he played a leading role in the formation of the PAIGC, the African Party of Independence of Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. The organization of Guinea and Cape Verde, oh my gosh, by nationalist decolonial revolution, but also because he reflected on this revolutionary process with others at home and around the world. His occupation of so many subjects, position, student, diplomats, organic intellectuals, poet, ergonomists, general secretary, revolutionary, and so forth, give rise to the critical discourse and practice that performantly puts into question the limits of white armchair critical theory. Cabral's directive found the analysis of a few types of resistance, translated here for the first time, along with the role of culture and the struggle for independence. Ford students and specialists of African politics, advocates of contemporary anti-racist struggles and anti-imperialist activists with the critical thoughts of the revolutionary who perspicaciously, I'm going to look up that word. I don't know if I say that. SP, there it is, I think. Hold on, will it do the meaning? No, of course not. Another commercial, everybody. Perspicaciously. That's wild. Understood and successfully directed a mass political program around such issues. Since a number of masterful histories and analysis of decolonization in Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde already exist, I will instead briefly locate both of these texts, historically and politically, and then take up a variety of critical theoretical themes that can be gleaned from Cabral's thought but have not received significant attention. Specifically, I bring into relief Cabral's configuration of history, his critique of religion, and his environmental concerns as only three avenues of understanding and further developing an anti-colonial theory. But the translated text in this volume suggests alternative possibilities of reinventing critical theory, not touched on in this introduction. The reflection below will be necessarily brief and experimental, but I introduce Cabral's thought this way, rather to students, specialists, or activists, with intuition that a polyphone of these works can open on to wider audiences, and thereby encourage further attempts to rethink contemporary African critical theory and praxis. Historical situations, analysis of a few types of resistance, and the role of culture in the struggle of independence. Cabral delivered a directive collective and analysis of the few types of resistance in November 1969, a little over a decade after the Penjugeti dock massacre in Bissau on the 2nd and 3rd August 1956. Workers went on strike over wages, and in retaliation, the Portuguese colonial police killed at least 50 people and wounded even more. The massacre marked the initial shift in PAIGC strategy away from peaceful protest and union organization to a vanguardist mobilization of the peasant masses, with recently colonized Nkokori to the south as their primary hub, while the persuasion of mobilization of various ethnic groups in Guinea's territory interior proved to be a substantial challenge. By late 1962 to 63, rural presence, especially the Balentas, began to join the PAIGC in large numbers. By January 1963, the PAIGC had acquired a significant number of supporters, arms, and training to form the first guerrilla units in rural Guinea. The first 6 years into the PAIGC's armed by nationalist, anti-imperialist, and revolutionary struggle against Portuguese colonialism in Guinea were years of trial and error, successes and failures, and discoveries and anticipated strengths and weaknesses. Between 1963 and 1969, the PAIGC had begun to grow in numbers, had garnered support through a policy of non-alignment from a wide range of actors, such as the USSR, Sweden, Ghana, Guinea, Kokori, China, and others, had begun to free and maintain control over liberated areas in the south and east of Guinea, and had also more effectively reorganized intra-party chains of command in order to significantly quell mountaintopism, opportunism, witch hunts, and inter-tribal conflicts and abuses of local populations. But as Cabral himself frequently point out, no struggle exists without concomitant failures, losses, setbacks, and mishaps are simply part of what it means for something to be considered a struggle. According to Cabral, such setbacks in the protracted Revolutionary War included carelessness, magical interpretation of reality, careerism, idleness, and so forth. This include only some of the internal difficulties that he addresses in his analysis of a few types of resistance. But such problems are, of course, also compounded by the exogenous. Let's find out. It's another word. There it is.
Exogenous.
Exogenous, orientating or produced outside of a system organized or bodied. It's exogenous difficulties wrought by Portuguese colonialists, oppression, and crimes against humanity throughout this era. At the time of Cabral's delivery of the analysis of a few types of resistance, Portuguese encountered counter-revolutionary efforts led by Antonio de Spinola, a governor and commander-in-chief of Guinea from 1968 to 1972, having led a Portuguese force under Franco during the Spanish Civil War and having operated as a observer of the Nazis on the Leningrad front. Spinola now commanded troops in West Africa under the auspice of the Salazarist authoritarian dictatorship in Portugal. This resume, along with the napalm bombing of hospitals, schools, and granaries, the systematic destruction of refugee camps, and the annihilation of areas cleared by the PAIGC for crops diversification, made this erect a monoclode governor general into a near, caricature of a archetypical colonialist. Jesus Christ. Cabral's directives should be read in the context of Spinola, various counter-revolutionary tactics, rather of intrigue or carpet bombing, and the PAIGC's forceful resistance to the countering of such renunciation. Nevertheless, as analysis of the few types of resistance demonstrate, Cabral had both larger and similar problems than the mere I can't say that, with his roaming steward of fascist warfare. Larger, he rethinks the dialectical role of culture, class, and identity in the anti-imperialist politics generally, and continues to create a stronger judicial personality and legitimacy for the PAIGC around the world. And smaller, he manages the day-to-day obstacles confronting the organization of the revolution in binational liberation and the banalities that accompanied such governance. As lecturers delivered to the party cadres, analysis of a few types of resistance served didactic, corrective, organizational, and motivational ends. Historians Mustafa Diada correctly notes that these seldom examined directives can be understood as helping Cabral and his movement tackled internal dissent and external challenges related to armed struggle against Portugal. If some have read the 1966 speech in Havana, presuppositions and objectives of national liberation in relation to social structures, as Cabral's analysis of the PAIGC's struggle by means of critical engagement with Marxist-Leninism, then one might read analysis of a few types of resistance as in part influenced by Truangan Chanjin. First of all, we know that Shenzhen, the resistance will win, existed in Guinea during the revolution and was almost certainly read by Cabral, which would also explain his various analogies made in the directives between Guyana and Vietnamese anti-imperialist struggles. Secondly, the thematic structures of the directives. Oh my gosh, this guy likes to use lots of words. Hold on a second. I can't say it. Homologously. Let's see what it means. Oh my God. Which means having the same relative position, structures, or evolutionary origins, even if they serve different purposes. Mirrors proportions of Xing's texts, namely chapter 5 through 8. Resistance in the military field, resistance in political field, resistance in economic field, and resistance in cultural fields. Cabral not only draws on the form of part of Xing's text, but also from its content. In so many words, he adopts and redeploys with a necessary local adjustment and concrete analysis some of Xing's holistic formulations. For instance, that the resistance of our people must be carried out in every field, military, economic, political, and cultural. Cabral makes use of Xing's work, written during the Vietnamese struggle against the French in 1947. To understand Guinea's struggle, he is also no doubt thinking of Vietnamese resistance war against the United States in the late 1960s. In this sense, Cabral triangulates the past and present anti-imperialist struggles of the Vietnamese, however, cursorily in an attempt to learn from the strengths and weaknesses of these struggles. In terms even broader than the party's general watchword, the four corners of resistance that Cabral analyzes politically, economic, culturally, and armed outlined and reinforces PAIGC strategy in 1969. For Cabral, resistance includes but cannot be limited to resilience in the face of colonial oppression. Contrary to the occasional connotations of the term in various contemporary discourse, resistance for Cabral does not only consist of a reactionary, pacific, or reformist management of monopoly capitalist and imperialist forces. Instead, various cultural practices of resistance are incorporated within and understood alongside the process of revolutionary decolonization as a whole, which also includes the aspects of armed, economic, and political resistance. In this case, Cabral and the PAIGC's project of revolutionary decolonization is markedly different from the project of those who would see the formation and practices of cultural resistance along as sufficient for radical political transformation. The four corners of Cabral's square of resistance are inseparable and must be orientated so as to be mutually reinforcing. This is why he does not only set up a system of barter and ban, and the use of Portuguese currency only encourages the establishment of schools and the continuation of forms of dancing, singing, and dress. Only criticize opportunism and mountaintopism and armed struggle, and only take seriously the need to create revolutionary democratic practices for the sake of the future post-colonial government accountability. Rather, the revolutionary colonial struggle requires all these and gives shifts in perspectives and complexities and struggles of a post-colonial land to come. Each can be considered fundamental, equiprimordial, one might say. From a given vantage point, economic resistance proves fundamental insofar as Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, could not survive without continually developing the agricultural and productive forces necessary to meet these territories' basic needs. Cultural resistance proves fundamental insofar as decolonial revolution must draw from local cultures' resources to forge a new national consciousness. A sense of society without a unique living and breathing culture would not be worth inhibiting. Political resistance is fundamental since it is through political action that Guinea and Cape Verde will be liberated and their independence recognized in the international sphere. An armed resistance is fundamental insofar as the other forms of resistance prove insufficient to record the material forces that constitute the struggle between the relevant realities in motion. While these four corners of resistance are often explained in terms of one another, each considered separately constitutes a necessary but insufficient condition for a truly liberated decolonial revolution. Real quick, I'm gonna pause here for a second and see if there's a stopping point coming up. 57. There is. Okay, cool. Almost done. All right, cool. All right. And when these aspects conflict with one another, the people should work with party leadership in order to determine how best to proceed. Cabral later pens, quote, the role of culture and struggle for independence, end quote, for a different audience and with special yet contagious concerns in mind regarding the struggle. The text was written for a UNESCO meeting of experts on the notion of race identity and dignity, and delivered in absentia. In less than 7 months' time, the internal conspirators, oh my gosh, this person's name I can't say, Sinkino Kini, with the backing of the support of Portugal's secret police, would assassinate Cabral's inquiry. Thus, this speech represents the late Cabral's attempt to grapple with and synthesize his thoughts on culture, liberation, and anti-imperialist struggles. After nearly a decade of protracted struggles, while he intentionally chose to speak simply, clearly, and directly to the illiterate peasant, backbone of the local struggles, Cabral's speeches often analyze and generalize large issues from out of Guinea and Cape Verde's concrete realities. In this way, a comparison of the two texts of this volume brings to the force with revolutionary ability to both address the concrete concerns of the struggle of the ground and also to reflectively translate these political concerns for the international audience. Cabral packs quite a number of profound theses into the relatively short piece. To begin, he argues that the adequate grassroots study and comprehension of a culture's effects on the roles of within revolutionary social change is an epistemic accomplishment of such struggles themselves. Local struggles achieve the articulation of this epistematic linkage between culture and anti-imperialist politics from within the anti-colonial context itself. Not only do colonialists empirically in social science fail to understand such real economic and social political processes, but even many diasporic elites and petty bourgeoisie intellectuals misunderstand the role of culture in the struggle for independence. Cabral argues that local culture do not undergo a sudden renaissance of performative anarchistic leap back to a pristine origin during decolonization. Even if this culture return were possible as only one element of the four corners of the square of resistance, attempts at such a return would prove politically inept. He writes, a return to one's origins is not, nor can it be, in itself an act of struggle against foreign domination, colonial and or racist, nor does it necessarily mean a return to traditions. Instead, cultures adapt and persist over time despite colonialist oppression, and enforced stagnation in colonized cultures have been a constant source of more or less inadequate resistance to this domination. The desire by some petite bourgeoisie elites to return to some original culture source are marks at best a first negative moment in the dialectic of revolutionary mobilization. And this first negation proves insufficient insofar as it fails to break with and surpass the underlying contradictions of colonialism. This contradiction consists, on one hand, of the white supremacist preservation of auto. Oh my gosh, I gotta look up this word. It's another word. We're almost done. AUTOCH. There it is. Autochthonous, indigenous or originating right in a place where it was found. Autochthonous identities in order to racially divide the rulers from the rule, and on the other hand of the destruction of these same autochthonous identities, social structures, and cultures in order to accumulate raw materials and surplus value. Any form of anti-colonial politics that does not set for itself the overcoming of this basic contradiction leaves it intact with all its constitutive and exploitative policies, presuppositions, and self-justification and delusion. The overcoming of this colonialist contradiction requires a detailed analysis of revolutionary reinvigoration of oppressed cultures, and in the context of national liberation, the unification of these local countercultures occurs during the development of a national consciousness under the directions of a political party. Cabral postulates, quote, culture is dynamic syntheses of the material and intellectual reality of societies expressed rational relations both between man and nature, and well as between different groups of men within the same society. But culture does not only relate to national liberation as a mere instrumental precondition. Culture contributions essentially to the liberation struggles, yet the liberation struggles is not only a cultural fact, but a factor of cultural as well. This means that there exists a reciprocal and non-linear relations between culture and revolution. Cultures must be understood and organized to effectively orient revolution, yet revolution themselves altered the dynamic syntheses and material and intellectual realities as expressed by relations between societal groups and nature. This is why one should not be surprised at the prosody of Cabral's notion of armed and cultural resistance as expressed in analysis of the few types of resistance. Armed resistance and cultural resistance are fluid categories precisely because they reflect the plasticity of these social realities. To take up arms as also a form of cultural resistance and cultural expression. The flexibility of Cabral's concepts, his traditions of the problems and strategies of anti-colonial politics between peasants and diplomats, and his connections of other Vietnamese and Algerian anti-imperialist struggles with those of West African struggles, that one should adopt a similarly malleability. Oh, we're gonna have to look up that word too. Figures I have to look at more words as soon as I get close to the end. MALLEABLE. Malleable, my bad. Malleable, theoretical, and discursive openness to the critique of society and imperialism, while rethinking critical theory alongside Cabral, as Basil Davison wrote while traveling through Guinea with Cabral, avoided the NATO-sponsored napalm bombs of Portuguese counter-revolutionary aero politics. But there are also certain ways in which Guinea may be more than interesting in itself, may be microcosmic in meaning a paradigm of the African situation in the late 1960s, a place not only worth observing for itself, but also worth learning from. The speeches of this volume prove to be worth learning from the content of even more than reasons and sheer historical interest. Each text can be reflected upon for the sake of reimagining critical theory outside the canonical boundaries by which it often delimits its own terrain. To this end, in the next section, I briefly consider a number of ways in which Cabral assists us in rethinking. 1. Critical genealogy and the dismantling of colonial regimes of historical representation. 2. The critique of religion in anti-colonial politics. And 3. Revolutionary anti-colonial misology. I'm going to look at that. After this, I will offer suggestions of ways to understand how these facets of Cabralist critical theory overlap with 21st century anti-imperialist political concerns. And we'll stop there at page 59, Critical Genealogy and the Dismantling of Colonial Regimes of a Historical Representation.
All right, that was cool.
Yeah, it was cool. I feel like we're still on the freaking introduction because I think we're gonna read his stuff. But I think I like when they like brought up that Cabral is a Marxist and stuff like that. Like, yeah, and he talks about utilizing these other liberation struggles, but like utilizing what might be universal to their needs, but also adapting it to their conditions is definitely a Marxist thing to do, to analyze what's going on and see what can be adaptable and changed, and then like looking at that structure wherever you implement to see if like it's parallel to reality and making adjustments or taking away. Plus, he also goes into the fact that like these unsuccessful things actually bring on more analysis to their things. So that's cool, you know. That's cool.
See, I told you it was cool.
But anyways, it is 8:02, everybody. I appreciate whoever sat around and listened and whatever. I'm going to go ahead and close it out. I'm going to go do some elevation and some studying, and then we'll see what happens tonight.